There comes a moment in almost every relationship with an avoidant when everything shifts, and the shift is not what people usually expect. Most think the turning point is when the avoidant pulls away, when they create distance, when they retreat into silence, or even when they break things off. But the real transformation doesn't begin there. It begins when you, the partner who has been anxiously chasing, stop caring. Not as a trick, not as a manipulation, not as reverse psychology to get them back, but because something deep inside of you changes. You stop explaining yourself over and over. You stop waiting for their crumbs of affection. You stop handing over your emotional power in hopes that they will suddenly wake up and meet you halfway. And when that shift happens in you, something cracks in them. Because for the first time, the avoidant realizes the control they once relied on has disappeared. For avoidant individuals, control is not simply a preference. It is survival. They grew up believing closeness was unsafe, that vulnerability meant danger, rejection, or suffocation. So they built a system where distance equals safety. In their minds, the less they need from others, the more powerful and independent they feel. And when they sense that you care too much, when you chase them, when you explain, defend, and overcompensate, it reassures them. It tells them, I can retreat, I can give less, I can ration my affection, and you'll still stay. Your energy feeds their illusion of safety and their sense of control. But when your silence replaces your explanations, when your calm replaces your pleading, when your indifference replaces your anxiety, all that control evaporates. And in that evaporation, the avoidant feels something they rarely admit: panic. It is not the kind of panic that shows on the outside. You may not see it. They may still act cold, rational, detached. But inside, the absence of your energy feels like a crack in their carefully constructed mask. Because avoidants expect conflict. They expect you to chase. They expect emotional fireworks, heated discussions, late-night arguments where you beg them to open up. But your calm detachment doesn't fit the script. At first, it confuses them. Why aren't you reacting? Why aren't you upset? Why aren't you demanding closeness like before? That confusion slowly turns into a quiet kind of fear, because avoidants are highly attuned to whether or not they still matter to you. For years, they've been playing a psychological dance where they push away just enough to keep the relationship unbalanced. You give more, they give less. You explain, they withdraw. You chase, they retreat. And deep down, they know it works because you care too much to let go. But the moment you stop playing your part in that cycle, the whole structure collapses. When an avoidant realizes that your care is not simply on pause, but gone, truly gone, something inside them shifts in ways they never expected. At first, many avoidants test the waters. They don't come running back with full vulnerability, because that's not how they're wired. Instead, they send out little feelers. A casual hey text after weeks of silence. A random comment on social media. Bringing up an old memory just to see how you'll respond. Sometimes they even poke at you with small provocations just to get a reaction. These are not grand gestures of love. They're subtle attempts to see if they still matter, if they can still draw energy from you, if the control is still in their hands. And when you don't take the bait, when you remain grounded, calm, and unmoved, that's when reality sinks in. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant is faced with something they've spent years avoiding: their own emotions. Because here's the truth about avoidance that most people don't understand. They do feel. They feel deeply. But they don't know how to sit with those feelings. They don't know how to hold them without fear. So instead of processing their emotions in real time, they delay them. They intellectualize them. They convince themselves that the distance they create is protection rather than self-sabotage. But when you detach, when you step away from the cycle and stop fueling the dynamic, those emotions have nowhere to hide. and slowly, they begin to catch up with the avoidant. What rises first is not love, not clarity, not even longing, but discomfort. A subtle, gnawing discomfort that grows into regret, nostalgia, and eventually a haunting question. Did I just lose someone who actually cared about me? That realization does not come like lightning. It's not instant. It builds quietly, like a storm on the horizon, until suddenly it's unavoidable. And here's where it gets psychologically rich, because what the avoidant begins to miss is not just you as a person. They miss the emotional container you created, the way you reached out when they shut down, the way you cared even when they acted indifferent, the way you stayed when they pushed away. You were not perfect, of course. No one is. But the emotional investment you gave, the persistence of your care, created a kind of safety they didn't know how to receive at the time. And once it's gone, they feel the void. They feel the silence. They feel the freedom they thought they wanted. And it feels hollow. And that hollowness terrifies them. This is the paradox of the avoidant mindset. They spend months or years pushing away closeness because it feels overwhelming, only to realize too late that the distance they fought for so hard is actually loneliness. And in that loneliness, they start to miss you. Not because you were perfect, but because you loved them in a way they didn't know how to hold. Why does this dynamic hit avoidance so hard when the other person finally stops caring? To understand this, we have to look deeper into their psychology and the roots of their attachment style. For a dismissive or fearful avoidant, control is the foundation of emotional survival. They grew up in environments where vulnerability was dangerous. Maybe love was inconsistent. Maybe affection was tied to conditions. Maybe their needs were minimized or even ridiculed. So they built a survival strategy. If I don't need too much, I won't get hurt. If I don't depend on anyone, no one can disappoint me. This worked for them in childhood because it minimized pain. But in adulthood, in romantic relationships, that same strategy becomes their greatest barrier. They ration affection. They stay in control by deciding when and how intimacy will happen. They keep their partner guessing, always wondering where they stand. And as long as the anxious partner keeps playing along, explaining, waiting, defending, chasing, that system works. The avoidant feels secure because they know the power is in their hands. But here's the paradox. Control is only satisfying when the other person still cares. It's not fun to have the upper hand if there's no one left to hold it over. Once you stop caring, once you stop investing, their control turns into emptiness. Suddenly, the avoidant is faced with the reality that the partner they thought would always be there has slipped away. And here's what makes it so jarring for them. It doesn't happen with a big fight or dramatic ending. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. One day, you're explaining, pleading, trying to make them understand. The next day, you're not. You've accepted that you can't control their behavior, that you can't force love out of someone who is unwilling to give it freely. And in that acceptance, you reclaim your power. That calm energy is exactly what rattles the avoidance world. Because unlike anger, tears, or arguments, which they can dismiss or avoid, indifference cannot be negotiated with. Indifference cannot be soothed by a breadcrumb of attention. Indifference signals something final, something irreversible. It tells them the game is over. This is where their hidden emotions begin to surface, often in ways they don't even recognize themselves. At first, it might look like curiosity, sending a message just to see if you'll reply. Then, nostalgia, bringing up old memories, suddenly remembering the good times. Sometimes it shows up as subtle jealousy, making sure you notice that they've been talking to other people, not because they've moved on, but to test whether you still react. What they're really doing is trying to reestablish the emotional tether, the invisible thread that kept you tied to them. But when you no longer respond the way you used to, they are forced to face the emotions they've buried for years. This is the beginning of regret. Avoidants rarely admit regret out loud because it clashes with their self-image of independence and control. But internally, they feel it. They feel the loss of someone who once gave them stability, care, and emotional presence. The person they kept at arm's length is now out of reach. And that distance doesn't feel like safety anymore. It feels like loss. The irony is that for the anxious partner, this is the first taste of freedom. When you were chasing, you were constantly anxious, constantly wondering if you were enough. But when you detach, you realize that their silence doesn't define your worth. Their pulling away doesn't mean you're unlovable. It simply means they're trapped in their own patterns. That realization is powerful because it shifts the focus from them back to you. For the avoidant, however, this is a crisis. They're used to having partners who give endlessly, who fight to keep the relationship alive, who prove their love over and over. But when you stop proving, when you stop chasing, they're confronted with the possibility that they miscalculated, that they took you for granted, that maybe, just maybe, you were the one person willing to love them despite their walls, and now that chance is gone. And in that realization, they often experience what psychologists call a delayed emotional response. Because avoidants don't process loss in real time, they suppress it, deny it, avoid it. But eventually it leaks out. Maybe it comes as sudden nostalgia weeks later. Maybe it shows up as irritability, jealousy, or even a new rebound relationship meant to distract them. Sometimes it even appears as a surprising softness, a crack in the armor, where they finally show vulnerability. Not all avoidants reach this stage, but some do. And when they do, it's not because you chased them, but because you stopped. The turning point was never about them changing first. It was about you stepping out of the cycle. The moment you did, their entire structure of control collapsed. And this is where the story becomes less about them and more about you. Because while they're scrambling internally, you're rebuilding. You're realizing that your power never came from convincing them to stay. Your power comes from choosing yourself, setting boundaries, and recognizing that your value isn't measured by whether or not an avoidant chooses you. It's measured by your ability to choose peace, love, and mutual connection. And that's the real transformation, the one that outlasts their reactions, their regret, or even their potential return. Let's explore what happens next, once the avoidant realizes that your care is gone. The first thing to understand is that this moment is not simply about you, it's about the entire belief system they've lived by for years. Avoidants construct their identities around the idea that they don't need anyone, that independence is their ultimate safety. But this identity is fragile, because underneath it lies the same human longing we all share. The desire to be loved, understood, and accepted. When you cared too much, when you overcompensated for their distance, you confirmed their illusion. You proved in their mind that they could remain detached and still receive affection. But when you stop caring, that illusion collapses. Suddenly, their independence doesn't feel empowering anymore. It feels lonely. It feels hollow. It feels unsafe in a way they never anticipated. This is why many avoidants, when confronted with a partner's detachment, experience a subtle but powerful crisis. It's not just about losing you as a person. It's about losing the safety net they created through control. It's about realizing that the walls they built to keep themselves safe have now locked them in, cutting them off from the very connection they secretly crave. This crisis often plays out in stages. At first, confusion. They wonder why you're not reacting the way you used to. They test you, sending little signals, checking if they still matter. If you remain grounded, the next stage is discomfort. They start to feel the weight of your absence, not just physically, but emotionally. They notice the silence where your reassurance used to be. They sense the gap between your energy now and the energy you once poured into them. Then comes reflection. For many avoidants, this is the hardest stage because it forces them to face feelings they've suppressed for years. Regret begins to surface. Regret not only about losing you, but about realizing they might have sabotaged something that could have been real. They might remember the times you showed love without conditions, the patience you offered, the ways you tried to bridge the distance. And in hindsight, they see how little they gave in return. But here's the tricky part. Avoidants rarely express regret directly. Instead, it shows up in indirect behaviors. A late-night message saying they miss you, but without clarity. A comment on something you post, as if to remind you they're still around. A story about an old memory, framed casually, but meant to pull you back into emotional connection. These gestures are not necessarily about reconciliation. Sometimes they are, but often they're about testing whether they still have influence, whether they can still stir something in you, because if they can, it reassures them that their control is not completely lost. And this is where your role becomes crucial. Because this stage is not about what they do, it's about how you respond. If you take the bait, if you fall back into explaining, defending, or proving yourself, the cycle resumes. They regain their control, and the dynamic resets to what it was before. But if you remain steady, if you maintain your boundaries, if you continue to choose peace over chasing, then the power shift holds. And this, ironically, is the only place where real change becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Because avoidants do not change when you chase them. They change, if at all, when they are forced to confront the consequences of their distance. And your detachment is the mirror that shows them those consequences. For some avoidants, this moment sparks growth. They may slowly begin to soften, to take small steps toward vulnerability. Maybe they admit they pushed you away out of fear. Maybe they acknowledge they miss you, not because of control, but because of love. Maybe they seek therapy, or at least begin to question their patterns. For others, the opposite happens. The discomfort of vulnerability is too great, so they double down on avoidance. They may seek distraction in new relationships, convincing themselves they never cared in the first place. They may act indifferent, pretending your absence doesn't affect them. But even in this denial, something has shifted, because they can no longer pretend they had control all along. Your detachment broke the cycle, and whether they admit it or not, that loss echoes inside them. Meanwhile, something powerful is happening for you. As you maintain your calm, as you stop pouring your energy into someone who can't meet you halfway, you begin to heal. You realize that your worth was never tied to how much effort you put in to keep someone else comfortable. You realize that real love doesn't require endless chasing or constant explanations. You realize that the peace you feel now, the peace that comes from not needing their validation, is a stronger foundation than anything you had when you were caught in the push-pull dance. This healing is not about forgetting them or pretending you never cared. It's about reclaiming the energy you gave away and reinvesting it into yourself. It's about creating space for relationships where love flows both ways, where you don't have to prove your value through overgiving, where intimacy feels safe instead of like a battlefield. That's why this moment, as painful as it may be, becomes a turning point, not only for them, but for you. For the avoidant, it's the shock of realizing they no longer hold the strings. For you, it's the liberation of finally cutting those strings and choosing yourself. And that choice, your choice, is what truly shifts everything. Not because it forces them to change, but because it frees you from the endless cycle of trying to fix someone else's fear of intimacy. You no longer need their approval to feel worthy. You no longer depend on their crumbs of affection to feel loved. You are no longer playing the role they relied on you to play. And once you step out of that role, their entire script collapses. This is why, for many people who've loved an avoidant, the most powerful moment is not when the avoidant comes back, but when you no longer need them to, because in that moment, you've already won. When you stop caring, something remarkable happens, not only within the avoidant, but within yourself. You see, relationships with avoidants often run on a very subtle but powerful exchange of energy. They hold back, you lean in. They retreat, you pursue. They ration affection, you compensate by overgiving. It's like a dance where every step they take away pulls you 2 steps closer. But when you stop playing your role, when you stop leaning in every time they pull back, the dance collapses. The rhythm is gone, the balance they relied on disappears, and suddenly they are no longer leading. For the avoidant, this shift feels like standing on unstable ground. For years, maybe decades, they've relied on the same strategy. Distance equals safety. But your detachment breaks that strategy. Now distance doesn't feel safe anymore. It feels risky, because distance once meant you'd chase. Now distance means silence, space, and possibly losing you forever. And that realization forces them into a corner where they must face themselves. At first, many avoidants respond with denial. They tell themselves they don't care either. They remind themselves how much they value independence. They distract themselves with work, hobbies, even new relationships. But denial doesn't erase the shift. It only delays it. Because eventually, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, the reality sets in. You are no longer orbiting around them. Your attention, your energy, your love, the things they once took for granted, are no longer available. And that absence cuts deeper than they expect. Some avoidants react with testing behaviors. They might reach out casually, acting as though nothing has changed. They may drop breadcrumbs, small tokens of attention, just to see if you'll pick them up. A late-night "hey" message, a comment on your photo, a memory shared as if they're just being friendly. But beneath the surface, these are not casual gestures. They are signals, probes, designed to answer one question: do I still matter to you? If you respond with the same intensity you once did, they regain their sense of control. But if you don't, if your response is calm, measured, or absent altogether, it forces them to feel something they've avoided their entire lives: powerlessness. Powerlessness is terrifying for the avoidant. Their entire attachment system is designed to keep them in control, to prevent the vulnerability that comes with dependence. But when you stop caring, when you stop feeding their illusion, they are forced to confront how much of their security came from your effort, not their independence. That's the paradox of avoidance. They believe they don't need anyone, yet they've secretly relied on your willingness to overcompensate. Without that, they're left with a mirror reflecting their own emptiness. And here's where the growth potential lies. Some avoidants will run from that mirror. They'll dive deeper into distractions, bury themselves in work, or rush into another relationship, hoping someone else will play the role you once did. But others, especially those who are ready for change, will begin to question themselves. They might wonder why your detachment hurts so much. They might start reflecting on their patterns, even if they don't say it out loud. They may feel regret not only for losing you, but for the way they've lived. Regret that their fear of closeness cost them real connection. Regret that they mistook distance for safety, only to find themselves lonelier than before. This regret doesn't always translate into action. Avoidants are not known for grand confessions or sudden vulnerability. But sometimes, in small, almost imperceptible ways, it leaks out. They might compliment you on something they never noticed before. They might linger longer in conversation, testing the waters of closeness. They might open up just a little, not with sweeping declarations, but with small cracks in the armor, an admission of missing you, or a hint of vulnerability hidden in casual words. And while these moments may not seem like much, for an avoidant, they are monumental. But here's the crucial point. This moment is not about whether they change. It's about whether you do. Because your detachment is not a tactic. It's a transformation. When you stop caring, it's not about punishing them or manipulating them into closeness. It's about reclaiming your own emotional energy. It's about realizing you don't need to chase love to prove your worth. It's about stepping out of a dynamic where your value was measured by how much you endured. For you, this is freedom. The silence that once felt unbearable now feels peaceful. The distance that once triggered anxiety now feels like space to breathe. The person who once held so much power over your emotions no longer defines your sense of self. And that freedom is what the avoidant feels most deeply, even if they don't admit it. Because your freedom highlights their captivity. Your peace highlights their unrest. Your self-worth highlights the cost of their avoidance. And that contrast, the contrast between your liberation and their discomfort, is what changes the dynamic forever. Whether they come back or not, whether they grow or not, you are no longer the same. You've broken the cycle. You've shifted the power. And most importantly, you've remembered something they could never take away. Your value was never theirs to define. When you finally stop caring, what happens next is not just about the avoidant. It's about the life you build beyond them. For so long, your energy has been tied to the push and pull of the relationship. You've spent nights wondering why they pulled away, why they couldn't just meet you halfway, why love felt so conditional. You carried the weight of holding the connection together, believing that if you just loved harder, explained better, or stayed patient longer, something would change. But now, you've stepped outside that loop. You're not trying to decode their silences. You're not trying to bridge the distance. And for the first time in a long time, your heart has space to breathe. For the avoidant, this shift can be deeply unsettling. Imagine someone who has built their entire sense of safety on control, always staying one step removed, always ensuring they never need too much. Suddenly, that control evaporates. The person they once relied on to do the emotional heavy lifting no longer plays that role. And the silence, the absence of your energy, begins to echo in their mind. They may replay old conversations, wondering why you aren't responding like before. They may scroll through your updates, searching for clues about where your focus has gone. They may even feel jealousy, not because they suddenly know how to love, but because your freedom reminds them of what they've lost. But here's the truth. Your healing cannot be tied to their realization. Whether they regret losing you, whether they finally face their own fears, whether they ever come back with vulnerability, that's not your responsibility. Your power lies in what you choose to do with this freedom. Do you use it to step into relationships that feel balanced and mutual? Do you use it to explore parts of yourself that were neglected while you were pouring energy into them? Do you use it to reclaim your voice, your joy, your peace? That's where the real transformation happens. Not in whether they wake up, but in whether you do. Still, it's worth understanding what goes on in their mind, because that knowledge can bring closure. For many avoidants, the realization that you no longer care is the first time they are forced to confront their own attachment wounds. All the defenses they built, the walls, the rationalizations, the insistence that they don't need anyone, suddenly feel less convincing when the person who once proved their worth by staying no matter what finally walks away emotionally. Some avoidants will respond by doubling down, telling themselves they're fine, distracting themselves with new people or busyness. But even then, late at night, the thought lingers. What if I pushed away someone who truly cared? Others may find the courage to face themselves. It might not look like a grand apology, but you may notice small attempts at vulnerability, small cracks in the armor. They might reach out more consistently. They might reflect on their own behavior in ways they never did before. They might even begin to take responsibility, not because you demanded it, but because your absence created a space where their excuses no longer fit. This doesn't guarantee a healthy reconciliation, but it does mean something powerful. Your choice not to care broke the cycle of avoidance. And here is the paradox. When you no longer need them to change, that is when change becomes possible. Not always, not perfectly, but sometimes. Because your detachment removes the pressure they've always run from. It forces them to sit with themselves, without the comfort of knowing you'll always be there no matter how much they pull away. In that space, growth can begin. But it's their journey, not yours to manage. For you, the journey is about reclaiming your self-worth. It's about understanding that love is not meant to feel like constant chasing. It's not meant to feel like begging for scraps of attention. Real love feels mutual, reciprocal, safe. And sometimes the greatest gift an avoidant gives you is the opportunity to see that clearly. By pushing you to your limit, by forcing you to stop caring, they inadvertently return you to yourself. They remind you that your worth does not depend on their validation, that your value does not shrink because they were unable to hold it. And as you move forward, this shift doesn't just change your relationship with them, it changes every relationship you enter. You'll find that you're less willing to settle for imbalance. You'll recognize the red flags of avoidance sooner. You'll trust your intuition more. And perhaps most importantly, you'll no longer tie your peace to someone else's behavior. So what happens when an avoidant realizes you don't care anymore? For them, it feels like losing control, facing fears they've avoided for a lifetime, and being forced to confront emotions they buried long ago. For you, it feels like liberation. It's not about revenge. It's not about making them chase. It's about choosing yourself in a way you never have before. And in that choice, you rediscover a truth that's been with you all along. You were always enough. This is the shift that changes everything. Not when they finally realize your worth, but when you finally realize you don't need them to. That is when healing truly begins. That is when peace becomes possible. And that is when the love you've always given others finally finds its way back home to you.